The Life and Lies of Boris Johnson, from the day he was born to the day he became Prime Minister. June 1964. Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson is born in New York. His earliest recorded ambition is to become World King. 1982. In a letter to Johnson's father, an Eton schoolteacher writes of the 17-year-old Boris Johnson,
"He sometimes seems affronted when criticised for what amounts to a gross failure of responsibility, and surprised at the same time that he was not appointed captain of the school for the next half. I think he honestly believes that it is churlish of us not to regard him as an exception, one who should be free of the network of obligation that binds everyone else."
1983. Johnson becomes a leading member of Oxford University's male-only Bullingdon Club. During his tenure, the club's members indulge in sexist taunting, vandalism, restaurant trashing, bullying and ritual humiliation of the poor. One recruiter for the club will later describe it during Johnson's time, saying Bullingdon members
found it amusing if people were intimidated or frightened by their behaviour. I remember them walking down a street in Oxford in their tails, chanting "Buller, Buller," and smashing bottles along the way just to cow people. Boris was one of the big beasts of the club. He was up for anything. They treated certain types of people with absolute disdain and referred to them as plebs.
1984. Sixth former Damien Furness visits Johnson's Oxford College for his entrance interview. Many years later, he will relate what happened.
"I was staying the night and had an evening to kill in the college bar. Johnson was propping it up with his coterie of acolytes, whose only apparent role in life was to laugh at his jokes. In the course of my pint, I felt obliged to finish. He mocked my speech impediment, my accent, my school, my dress sense, my haircut, my background, my father's work as a farm worker and garage proprietor, and my prospects in the scholarship interview I was there for. His only motivation was to amuse his posh boy mates."
1987. At the age of 23, Johnson marries the daughter of a millionaire art historian. Fresh out of university and aided by family connections, he lands a traineeship at the Times newspaper. 1988. Johnson is sacked as a trainee at the Times for making up a quote on his first front-page story. 1990. Johnson conspires with his Bullingdon Club friend Darius Guppy to have a fellow journalist assaulted. The two discuss in detail how badly assaulted the man will be, including cracked ribs and black eyes, before Johnson agrees to supply the journalist's address for the attack to be carried out.
"Boris, have you got this number? How badly are you going to hurt this guy?" "Okay, let me explain this. You will not be put into intensive care or anything like that." "Okay, Derry, I said I'll do it. Don't worry."
The conspiracy goes nowhere, and no attack happens. 1991. According to a friend of Johnson's wife, an incident occurs in which Johnson displays his frightening temper, after which his wife turns up at the friend's flat in Brussels looking shocked, scared and on the brink of tears. The marriage soon deteriorates as Johnson begins an affair with a barrister. 1993. Johnson gets his barrister girlfriend pregnant and is soon divorced for the first time. 1994. He is now a columnist for The Telegraph and The Spectator magazine. His columns include racially charged invectives such as slamming Nelson Mandela for the, quote, tyranny of black majority rule in post-apartheid South Africa, and describing Chinese workers as, quote, puffing coolies. 1995. He describes the children of single mothers as, quote, ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive and illegitimate, saying it is, quote, outrageous that married couples should pay for the single mother's desire to procreate independently of men. In the same piece, he dismisses working class men as, quote, likely to be drunk, criminal, aimless, feckless and hopeless. 1998. Delighting in the resignation of gay cabinet minister Peter Mandelson for accepting an undisclosed loan from a friend, Johnson describes the gay community as, quote, tank-topped bumboys. 1999. Johnson is made editor of The Spectator magazine, promising owner Conrad Black he will not stand to be an MP. 2000. Johnson begins a relationship with one of his employees. He promises her that he will leave his wife to marry her. He does not leave his wife. 2001. Breaking his promise to the owner of The Spectator, Johnson stands to be an MP. He now promises voters in Henley that if they vote for him, he will step down as editor of The Spectator. That June, he becomes MP for Henley. He does not step down as editor of The Spectator. In a book he writes during the election campaign, Johnson compares equal marriage to a union between 3 men and a dog. 2002. Writing in The Spectator, Johnson defends British colonialism in Africa, saying, the problem is not that we were once in charge, but that we are not in charge anymore. Left to their own devices, the natives would rely on nothing but the instant carbohydrate gratification of the plantain. Meanwhile, in The Telegraph, he describes black Africans as, quote, flag-waving pickaninnies with watermelon smiles. 2003. Johnson is made vice chair of the Conservative Party and shadow arts minister. 2004, rumours circulate that Johnson has got one of his employees pregnant, resulting in her having an abortion. Johnson slams the suggestion as, quote, complete balderdash and an inverted pyramid of piffle, and assures Conservative Party leader Michael Howard that the claim is untrue. In reality, the rumours are entirely true. Johnson is sacked from his position as Tory Vice Chair and Shadow Minister for lying to the party leader. 2005, Johnson steps down as editor of The Spectator. Advising his successor on how to deal with a senior female colleague, he says, just pat her on the bottom and send her on her way. 2008, Johnson becomes Mayor of London. 2009, he fathers a child with an unpaid advisor to City Hall. 2013, the Court of Appeal throws out an injunction that has until now prevented Johnson being named as the father of the child. 3 judges rule that the public has a right to know about Johnson's, quote, reckless behaviour. By now, Johnson is having an affair with an American technology entrepreneur. Her company will receive £26,000 of public money while Johnson is mayor. She will later receive a £100,000 government grant intended for UK operating businesses, even after relocating to California the previous year. 2014, Johnson denies at least 17 times that he will stand as an MP while still in post as Mayor of London. 2015, Johnson stands as an MP while still in post as Mayor of London. 2016, hedging his bets, Johnson drafts 2 Brexit articles, one pro-Leave and the other pro-Remain. In his pro-Remain article, Johnson says the UK should remain, quote, intimately engaged in the EU, and that Brexit could cause an economic shock, the diminishing of Britain on the world stage, and the breakup of the Union. 2 days later, Johnson announces he will be campaigning for Vote Leave. On June 23rd, Britain votes to leave the EU. Prime Minister David Cameron resigns. Johnson is the leading figure to replace him, but his leadership campaign soon implodes when his own campaign manager, Michael Gove, says that Johnson is, quote, not capable of leading the country. Instead, Cameron is succeeded by Theresa May. She makes Johnson Foreign Secretary. 2017, Johnson fails to impress in the role, making a series of dangerous gaffes. Most notably, he significantly undermines the legal case of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, a British Iranian held in Iran on charges of espionage. It will be a further 5 years before she is finally released. 2018, Johnson resigns as Foreign Secretary and returns to his £250,000 a year job as a columnist for the Daily Telegraph. He's soon using his column to label women who wear burqas as, quote, letterboxes. His brother Leo, who's married to a Muslim, slams Johnson for his, quote, bigotry. In the week following his outburst, Islamophobic incidents increase across the UK by almost 400%. Almost half of all reported in-person abuse directly references Boris Johnson or the language he used. Johnson is now having an affair with Carrie Symonds, a former communications director for the Conservative Party. Johnson and his wife will soon separate. 2019, police are called to Symonds' South London flat after reports of a serious altercation. Neighbours report hearing a woman screaming, followed by slamming and banging. Symonds is reportedly heard screaming at Johnson to, quote, get off me and get out of my flat. Symonds will soon be expecting a baby. It is the 5th time as a married man that Johnson has made another woman, who isn't his wife, pregnant. On the 19th of July, following an internal Conservative Party coup against Theresa May, Johnson fulfills his lifetime ambition and becomes Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Everything in this film was known before the Tory Party made him Prime Minister. His tenure has been an administrative and a moral failure. The question now is, what will Conservative MPs do about it?
He's been going around the country talking about what he sees as his great achievements in office, a clue there to how unreconciled he is to the fact that he's being turfed out of office.
As Boris Johnson leaves office, he wants to talk about his legacy. OK, let's talk about his legacy. July 2019. Following a concerted campaign to destabilise the premiership of Theresa May, Boris Johnson fulfills his lifetime ambition and becomes Prime Minister. One of his first consequential acts is to advise the Queen to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks, subverting democracy in order to avoid scrutiny of his Brexit plans. A court finds that Boris Johnson's advice to Buckingham Palace recommending the suspension was flawed and untrue. In other words, he lied to the Queen. December, he brandishes his so-called oven-ready deal on the campaign trail before winning a majority of 80 at the general election. 2 years later, he will seek to have the deal overturned. January 2020, as cases of a new coronavirus start spreading, NHS England declares its first ever Level 4 critical incident. February. The government holds 5 emergency COBRA meetings to agree Britain's response to the COVID crisis. Johnson misses all 5 meetings.
The Prime Minister did not attend any of them. Is that true?
He didn't.
Instead, he retreats to his country house at Chevening to finalise divorce plans and a financial settlement with his estranged wife. He also reportedly spends time working on an overdue biography of Shakespeare, for which he's already been paid. March 23rd, Johnson finally orders a national lockdown. A detailed scientific analysis will later find that delaying the decision by a week cost 21,000 lives. March 27th, Johnson tests positive for COVID. He falls seriously ill but eventually recovers. May the 10th.
You must obey the rules on social distancing, and to enforce those rules, we will increase the fines for the small minority who break them.
10 days later, Johnson attends a party at Downing Street against his government's own lockdown rules. 100 invitees are told to bring your own booze. After the party, one of Johnson's advisers will message a colleague to say, "We seem to have got away with it." 2 days later, news of Dominic Cummings' lockdown-busting trip to Barnard Castle emerges.
Mr Cummings, are you going to resign?
Johnson is faced with a choice: defend the government's public health messaging in the face of a deadly pandemic that's claiming tens of thousands of lives, or back his adviser. Johnson chooses to trash the government's COVID strategy and instead support Cummings.
He has acted responsibly and legally and with integrity.
June, Johnson attends an illegal party with 30 people in the cabinet room. October, a mystery donation of £52,800 is made to the Conservative Party by Johnson's friend Lord Brownlow. It will later transpire that Johnson is engaged in an expensive refurbishment of the Downing Street flat and has asked Brownlow to pay for it, despite the arrangement being a breach of electoral law. Designer Lulu Little has been hired, with individual rolls of gold wallpaper costing £800 each. That same month, an investigation by Good Law Project reveals the existence of a secretive VIP lane for companies seeking to secure government COVID contracts. The system allows businesses and individuals with political connections to the Conservative Party to gain preferential treatment as they seek to land huge contracts for PPE. The resulting deals often involve inflated prices and the supply of unusable equipment. October 31st. Johnson refuses to countenance a further lockdown, telling colleagues, let the bodies pile high in their thousands. November. The COVID death toll passes 50,000. 2 days later, Johnson attends a party in the Downing Street flat to celebrate the departure of his adviser, Dominic Cummings. December. There is a slew of Downing Street parties. At one of them, red wine is said to have been sprayed on the walls, while one source describes the scene inside the event as carnage. The party will later become infamous when Johnson's staff joke at a mock press conference about how to keep details of what happened from the public.
This fictional party was a business meeting. And it was not socially distanced.
January 26, 2021, the COVID death toll passes 100,000. April 16th, 2 Downing Street parties are held on the eve of Prince Philip's funeral. A staffer is sent out to bring back a suitcase full of booze before drunken partygoers break the child's swing in the Downing Street garden. The next morning, the Queen follows Johnson's lockdown rules, mourning alone. August. As British and American forces conduct a disorderly exit from Afghanistan, the Taliban retakes power, triggering chaotic scenes as thousands try to flee through Kabul airport.
This is an emergency now. Tens of thousands are trying to get through. At the front, they're being crushed.
According to a whistleblower, Boris Johnson personally intervenes to request the evacuation team use considerable capacity to rescue 94 dogs and 68 cats from an animal charity. Meanwhile, countless Afghan civilians, including those who have worked for British forces in the country, are left behind to face the Taliban. Johnson denies any involvement in prioritising the rescue of animals over people.
This whole thing is total rhubarb.
But another whistleblower exposes this latest lie.
In evidence to the Foreign Affairs Committee, Josie Stewart wrote, it was widespread knowledge that the decision on Nowzad's Afghan staff came from the Prime Minister.
October 26th. MP Owen Paterson is found guilty of egregious breaches of paid lobbying rules by the House of Commons sleaze watchdog, including lobbying for health company Randox, having helped them secure over £500 million in government COVID contracts without tender or an open process. November. Paterson faces suspension from Parliament, but Johnson backs Paterson and instead tries to change the rules by curtailing the power of the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, the body investigating Paterson. After a public outcry, Johnson is forced to back down and Paterson is suspended. The Standards Commissioner is also probing the funding of Johnson's flat renovation, raising questions about his motivations for seeking to neuter the body. Days later, the public learns for the first time that Johnson and his colleagues attended numerous parties which broke his own rules. December the 1st, Johnson lies to the public.
All guidance was followed completely during number 10.
December the 7th, he lies again.
All the guidelines were observed, continue to be observed.
Over the following weeks and months, Johnson will repeatedly lie about his attendance at and knowledge of the parties. December 9th, the Electoral Commission delivers its verdict on the flat renovation scandal. Johnson is found to have failed to properly report the donations from Lord Brownlow. The Conservative Party is fined £17,000. January 12th, 2022, the government's VIP lane for awarding COVID-19 contracts is ruled unlawful by the High Court. February, Johnson makes MP Chris Pincher his Deputy Chief Whip. April, Boris Johnson becomes the first sitting Prime Minister in history to be found to have broken the law when he's fined by the Metropolitan Police for breaking his own lockdown rules. May, Sue Gray publishes her report into Partygate, detailing how officials in government held rule-breaking parties, had drunken fights, threw up, sang karaoke, mocked security guards and cleaners. All of this, Gray concludes, was enabled by a failure of leadership at the heart of government. June 6th, John Penrose, the Prime Minister's anti-corruption czar, resigns.
It's pretty clear that he has broken the ministerial code in a very material way.
A week later, his ethics advisor, Lord Geidt, will also resign. June 30th, Johnson's Deputy Chief Whip, Chris Pincher, resigns in disgrace amidst reports that he sexually assaulted 2 men at a private club the night before. Questions are raised about what Johnson knew about Pincher's reputation at the time he appointed him. He sends ministers out to defend him in the media, repeating what is a lie.
I have had an assurance from number 10 that the Prime Minister was not aware of any specific allegation or complaint regarding the former Deputy Chief Whip.
July 5th, a devastating intervention by the former head of the Foreign Office confirms that Johnson was, in fact, aware of a formal complaint against Pincher when he appointed him, and that the complaint was upheld in a disciplinary process confirming his misconduct. The Prime Minister has once again been caught in a lie.
Prime Minister, this is about truth, isn't it? It's about whether people can believe what you say.
The next day, as dozens of his ministers resign en masse in an effort to force his resignation, Johnson is forced to confirm allegations that as Foreign Secretary he secretly met an ex-KGB spy allied to Vladimir Putin without any of his officials being present. July 7th.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party.
Amidst scandal, disgrace and an erosion of standards in public life, Boris Johnson finally resigns. He has presided over the 7th largest coronavirus death toll in the world, with COVID cited on the death certificates of over 200,000 people. Brexit is not done. Instead, Johnson is seeking to overturn his own oven-ready deal. Inflation stands at 9%. Energy bills are predicted to hit £5,000 a year. Britain's trade performance is the worst on record, and trust in politicians is at an all-time low. Levelling up, his signature policy, has been a total failure. 10 days later, parts of the UK hit 40 degrees centigrade and wildfires destroy streets in East London. Johnson ends his premiership as he started it, choosing to skip a crucial Cobra meeting on the crisis and instead going for a ride in a fighter jet and hosting a party at Chequers. With just 4 weeks left in Downing Street and Britain on the cusp of a social catastrophe, Johnson disappears on holiday to Slovenia. A week later, amid growing fear that the government has no plan to deal with the coming economic calamity, he goes on holiday again, this time to Greece. A Downing Street spokesperson says he won't be working unless urgently needed.